The day my daughter asked me not to come to her fiancé's house in my old shoes, I realized something broken had already entered her heart, and it was not money, not pride, and not class. It was shame. And shame is a dangerous thing, because once it enters a family, it starts teaching love to hide. My name is Maya, and this is the story of how I became the bad guy in my own daughter's eyes just to save her from losing herself. I worked my whole life with my hands. Those hands washed dishes, cleaned floors, folded clothes long after midnight, and carried grocery bags from one bus stop to another when my legs were too tired to walk. My hands were never soft. They were never pretty, but they were honest. I raised my daughter, Ava, alone. Her father walked away when she was 6. No long goodbye, no big fight, just a door closing, and then silence. After that, it was just me and her against the world. And I did everything I could to make her life better than mine. I missed meals so she could eat. I wore the same coat for years so she could have warm clothes. I worked double shifts so she could go to school with a backpack that looked like it belonged to every other child. I told myself that one day she would grow up, go to college, and never have to feel small the way I once did. And for a long time, she was proud of me. She used to tell people, "My mom is everything." She used to run into my arms after school, even when I smelled like bleach and sweat. She used to say my simple food was better than anything in a restaurant because I made it with love. Those were the years I lived for. Then she got older. Then she entered the world where people judged each other by the brand on their clothes, the car in the driveway, and the way their family spoke at dinner. And then she met Ethan. He was charming, smart, polite, in the kind of polished way that made you feel like he had been trained by expensive people to never say the wrong thing. He worked in finance. His family had money, property, and names that opened doors before they even knocked. At first, I was happy for her, because every mother wants her child to do better. Every mother wants more for her child. So when Ava told me, "Mom, I'm engaged," I cried. I cried because I saw her future. I saw a house with light in every room. I saw a table where no one had to count the pennies. I saw her wearing a white dress and smiling with the kind of peace I had always hoped life would give her. I hugged her and said, "Baby, I'm so proud of you." But she didn't hug me the way she used to. She smiled, but it felt careful, and I didn't understand why, until the changes started. She stopped wearing the simple earrings I gave her on her birthday. She stopped posting pictures with me. She started correcting little things I said, like the way I pronounced certain words or how I held a fork when we went out. I told myself she was just nervous. Weddings do that to people. Families do that to people. But then one evening, she came home looking upset, and she sat at the kitchen table without even taking off her coat. I asked, "What happened?" She hesitated, then said, "Mom, Ethan's parents are very traditional. They notice everything." I smiled gently. "Okay, that's fine. I know how to behave." She looked at me, then looked away, and that was the first time I saw it clearly. The embarrassment. Not full hatred, not cruelty, something worse. A quiet shame. She said, "They're very refined people. They're used to a certain type of family." I remember how those words hit me. A certain type of family. I had spent 25 years building a family with nothing but love, and suddenly I was being measured like I was a stain on a white tablecloth. Still, I stayed calm. I said, "Ava, I may not have their money, but I know how to respect people. I know how to speak kindly. I know how to sit at a table and make good company." She nodded, but she didn't meet my eyes. Then she said the words I will never forget. "Mom, please don't wear anything too old-fashioned to dinner, and maybe don't talk too much about our past." I stared at her. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. "Don't talk about our past?" She quickly added, "I just mean, you know, Ethan's family is very image conscious. They like things elegant. They don't really understand hardship stories." Hardship stories. That is what my life had become to her. A story to hide. something ugly that needed to be polished away. I felt my throat tighten, but I did not shout. I didn't cry in front of her. I just asked, very softly, "Are you ashamed of me?" She stood up immediately. "No, Mom, of course not. Don't say that." But the silence after her answer said everything her mouth would not. That night, after she went to sleep, I sat alone in the kitchen and looked at my hands. Those same hands had tied her hair when she was little. Those same hands had held her when she had nightmares. Those same hands had worked until they trembled so she could have a future. And I wondered when love had started to feel like a burden to her. The dinner with Ethan's family was 2 weeks later. I wore the best dress I owned. It was not expensive. It was simple. Dark blue, neatly pressed, and clean. I ironed it twice. I polished my shoes until they shone. I even went to the salon to get my hair trimmed because I wanted to look presentable. I wanted to make Ava proud. When she saw me, she paused for a second and said, "You look nice." But she said it like she was trying to be kind to an old memory. We arrived at Ethan's family home that evening. It was huge. Not just large, huge in a way that made you feel smaller the moment you stepped through the door. There were fresh flowers everywhere, soft lights, expensive paintings, a piano in the corner that probably cost more than my yearly salary. The air smelled like perfume and money. Ethan's mother, Mrs. Kingsley, greeted us with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ah, you must be Ava's mother," she said, looking me up and down just once, quickly, as if she had already decided where I belonged. "Yes," I said. "It's lovely to meet you." She nodded politely and turned her attention back to Ava. That was the first time I was made to feel invisible in a room I had entered with my own child. The dinner table was perfect. Too perfect. Every glass in place. Every plate matching. Every sentence measured. They asked Ava about her work, her goals, her plans for the future. They laughed at the right moments. They nodded when Ethan spoke. I sat quietly, trying to be gracious, trying to be grateful, trying not to show how small I felt. Then Mrs. Kingsley asked, "And what does your mother do?" Ava froze, just for a second. But I saw it. That tiny pause. That terrible little pause. Then she smiled too quickly and said, "Oh, she's been in home support work." Home support work. Not a lie. But not the truth either. Not the whole truth. Not the proud, hard truth. Mrs. Kingsley tilted her head. "How interesting." I smiled, even though my chest hurt. "Yes," I said. "I've worked hard all my life, honest work." The table went quiet for a beat too long. Then Ethan's father asked something else, and the conversation moved on. But I knew what had happened. My daughter had just made my life sound smaller so it would fit into their room. And I sat there with a smile on my face, while something inside me quietly broke. On the ride home, I said nothing. Ava kept looking at me in the rearview mirror, maybe hoping I would be angry, maybe hoping I would pretend I hadn't noticed. But silence is dangerous, because silence gives time for the truth to settle. When we got home, she finally said, "Mom, don't be upset." I laughed once, softly, not because it was funny, but because I was trying not to fall apart. "Upset," I repeated. "You told them I worked in home support like I was a hired servant in the background of my own child's life." She looked shocked. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" She crossed her arms. "I meant I didn't want them to judge you." That sentence landed harder than any insult. "You didn't want them to judge me," I said. "So you judged me first." Her face changed. "That is not fair." I stood up from the table. "Fair?" I said. "Fair is not asking your mother to become a stranger so your fiancé's family will accept you. Fair is not making me feel like I should apologize for every year I spent feeding you, clothing you, and loving you with everything I had." Her voice rose a little. "You're making this bigger than it is." And there it was, the moment every mother fears. When your child starts speaking to you like your pain is an inconvenience. I looked at her and asked, "Do you think money makes people better than us?" She said nothing. So I asked again, louder this time. Do you think those people are worth more than the woman who raised you? Her eyes filled with tears, but she still said nothing. And that silence told me what I needed to know. It wasn't just Ethan's family. It was the world she had started to believe in. A world where worth was measured by appearances. A world where love had to be hidden if it was too plain, too poor, too real. I walked to my room and closed the door. I did not sleep that night. I kept thinking about all the sacrifices I had made, and I kept wondering if I had raised her to be strong, or if I had accidentally raised her to be ashamed of the very life that made her strong. The next morning, I made breakfast, like always. Eggs, toast, tea, simple food, real food. Ava came into the kitchen looking tired. She sat down without speaking. I placed her plate in front of her, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be. The little girl who used to smile when I cut her toast into triangles. The little girl who used to say, "Mom, this tastes like home." That memory almost broke me. She looked at me and whispered, "I'm sorry." I wanted to forgive her immediately. A mother always wants to forgive, but forgiveness without truth is just another way to allow the wound to grow deeper. So I sat down across from her and said, "No, not yet." She looked confused. I continued, "I need you to understand something before you ask me to move on." She swallowed hard. "I was never ashamed of our life," I said. "Never. Not when we had nothing. Not when the landlord threatened us. Not when I had one pair of shoes with a hole in the sole. Not when I worked through Christmas, through illness, through heartbreak. I was never ashamed because I knew what that life meant. It meant survival. It meant dignity. It meant love." Tears rolled down her cheeks. I said, "But now you are embarrassed by the woman who survived for you." She shook her head. "No, Mom." "Yes," I said, gently but firmly. "You are." That was when she finally began to cry. Not the polite tears of regret people cry to get through an uncomfortable moment. These were real tears. The kind that come when someone finally sees the thing they have been refusing to face. She covered her face with her hands and whispered, "I didn't know how to explain our life to them." I leaned back in my chair. "That is exactly the problem," I said. "You think our life needs explaining." She looked up at me, and in that moment I knew she was beginning to understand. Not just the situation, the shame. Because shame grows quietly. It does not always sound cruel. Sometimes it sounds like, "I just don't want them to misunderstand." Sometimes it sounds like, "I'm protecting you." Sometimes it sounds like, "It's easier this way." But what it really means is this: I care more about being accepted than about being honest. And that is a terrible price to pay for love. Over the next few days, Ava became quieter. She avoided the subject. But I could see the guilt in her eyes. I knew she was torn. Because she loved Ethan. I knew that. And I was not blind enough to think love alone makes a person bad. But I also knew Ethan's family was not just a little formal. They had already begun teaching my daughter that the world she came from was something to be hidden, softened, edited. And if I let that continue, they would not just take her pride. They would take her voice. So I made a decision. One that hurt me more than I can explain. The next time Ethan's family invited us over, I said I would come. Ava looked relieved. But I told her, "I am coming as myself. Not as your quiet little background. Not as a polished version of some poor woman you can rebrand. I am coming as your mother." She looked nervous. "Mom, please don't cause a scene." I looked her straight in the eye. "I am not the one causing the scene," I said. "I am the one ending it." That evening, I wore the same blue dress. No expensive jewelry, no fake smile, no attempt to become something I was not. When we entered the house, Ethan's mother greeted me again with that careful smile. But this time, I didn't shrink. At dinner, She began asking the usual questions. Where did I grow up? Did I go to college? What did I do before? And I answered every question honestly. I told them I left school early because my father got sick. I told them I worked cleaning offices at night and stocking shelves at dawn. I told them I had raised Ava alone. I told them there were months when I chose between gas and groceries. I told them I had cried in bathrooms where no one could hear me because I did not want my daughter to see my fear. The room grew quiet. Ethan's father looked uncomfortable. His mother looked like she didn't know where to place her hands. Ava stared at me like she was hearing my life for the first time. Then Mrs. Kingsley said, "Well, that must have been very difficult." I smiled. "Yes," I said. "It was. But difficult is not shameful." No one spoke after that. Then I turned to Ava and said something I had been holding in my heart for days. Your life is not cleaner because you hide your mother, and your future is not brighter because you erase your past. Ava's eyes filled again. I continued, you can marry into wealth. You can learn new customs. You can sit at tables like this every week, if that is the life you want. But never let anyone make you believe that your roots are embarrassing. A woman who forgets where she came from will spend her whole life asking strangers who she is. The air in the room felt heavy. I could feel Ethan watching. I could feel his family trying not to react. But I wasn't speaking to them. I was speaking to my daughter, because she was the one I needed to reach. Then I said the line that changed everything. If loving you makes me the bad guy, then I will be the bad guy. But I will not stand here and watch you become ashamed of the woman who gave you everything. That was the first time Ethan's face softened. Not because he suddenly understood everything, but because he finally saw that I was not trying to ruin anything. I was trying to save my daughter from a kind of harm money cannot heal. After dinner, Ava asked me to wait outside with her. We stood under the porch light, and she cried harder than I had seen her cry in years. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." I said nothing at first. Then she said, "I thought I was helping us fit in." I took a breath. "That is what shame does," I said. "It convinces good people that erasing themselves is the same as protecting the people they love." She nodded and wiped her face. "I was so scared they would look down on you," she said. I touched her cheek. "Let them look," I said quietly. "A person who only respects what is expensive is not wise. They are just expensive." That made her laugh through tears. And for the first time in weeks, I saw my daughter again. Not the polished version. Not the frightened version. My daughter. The girl who had once been proud to say my name. The wedding happened a few months later, and it was beautiful. Not because it was grand. Not because it had the finest flowers or the most expensive cake. It was beautiful because Ava walked into that life with her eyes open. She did not hide me. She introduced me proudly. "This is my mother," she said, standing tall. "The woman who raised me." And when she said it, I saw something in her face I had feared was gone forever. Respect. Not for the rich house. Not for the expensive family. For herself. And that was all I ever wanted. Because that is what love is, really. Not making your child fit into every room. Not teaching them to chase approval at the cost of their soul. Real love says, stand up straight, tell the truth, keep your heart clean. Never be so desperate to belong that you betray where you came from. Months later, Ava came to visit me alone. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where all our hardest conversations had happened. She looked around and smiled softly. "You know," she said, "I used to think this house was too small." I raised my eyebrows. She nodded, embarrassed. "But now I think this was the first place I ever learned what love really looked like." I smiled, and tears came to my eyes before I could stop them. She reached across the table and held my hand. And I looked at those same hands of mine, the rough hands, the tired hands, the hands that had scrubbed and carried and sacrificed, and I realized something. I had never been poor in the ways that mattered. I had always had enough love to fill every room I entered. And my daughter finally knew it too. So if you are listening to me right now, let me say this clearly. A child does not become better by becoming ashamed of the person who raised them. And a mother is not less than because she comes from a simple life. That night, when I went home after the wedding, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel like I had won anything. I just felt tired. The kind of tired that settles deep in your bones after years of carrying something heavy and finally setting it down. I took off my shoes by the door, walked into the kitchen, and sat in the same chair where I had cried so many times before. The house was quiet, too quiet, and in that silence, I began to think about everything that had happened. I thought about the first time Ava ever called me Mom, in front of her fiancé's family with pride instead of hesitation. I thought about the way her voice had trembled when she introduced me. I thought about the look on Mrs. Kingsley's face when she realized I was not going to shrink for her comfort. And I thought about my daughter, my beautiful daughter, the child I had carried through poverty, through loneliness, through long nights and empty cupboards. I wondered how shame had entered her heart so quietly. I wondered if I had missed the first signs. That is the cruel thing about watching your child change. Sometimes it does not happen all at once. It happens in small pieces. A pause before speaking, a little embarrassment in the eyes, a sudden need to correct your accent, your clothes, your story. And by the time you notice it, the damage is already sitting at your table. 3 days after the wedding, Ava came to see me again. This time she did not call first. She just walked in with tears already in her eyes. I was washing dishes when I heard the door open. I turned around, and there she was, standing in the doorway like a child who had just been caught stealing something precious. "Mom," she whispered. I dried my hands on a towel and looked at her. "What happened?" She shook her head and tried to smile, but it failed before it even began. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Ethan's mother called me. I waited. She said," Ava continued, her voice cracking, "that you were very brave." I blinked. Not because I was surprised by the words, because I knew what kind of compliment that really was. People like Mrs. Kingsley do not often call someone like me brave unless they first assumed I was weak. Ava lowered her eyes. She also said she didn't realize how much you had sacrificed. I didn't say anything. Ava rubbed her hands together nervously and kept going. She said she had always believed that polished families were the best families, that she thought manners and money were enough. But after hearing you talk, she said something about real dignity. That word made my chest tighten. Dignity. It is a word rich people often use after they finally learn what poor people already know. Dignity is not about the house you live in. It is not about the car in the driveway. It is not about whether your table has a silk cloth or a chipped one. Dignity is what remains when life tries to strip everything else away. I sat across from Ava and asked quietly, "Why are you telling me this?" She swallowed hard. "Because I need you to know that I heard you," she said. I looked at her. She was trying so hard not to cry that her whole face was trembling. She continued, "I heard every word you said that night. And after the wedding, I kept thinking about it. I kept thinking about how I made you sound smaller, how I tried to make our life sound cleaner than it was. And I realized I wasn't just protecting myself." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I was protecting my own shame." Those words landed deep, because that was the truth I had been waiting for her to see. Not all shame is loud. Some shame wears a nice dress and speaks politely. Some shame says, "Let's not talk about that part." Some shame says, "That was the past." Some shame says, "They wouldn't understand." But at the center of all of it is the same fear. The fear of being seen as less. The fear of being judged. The fear that the life that made you who you are might not be good enough for the people you want to impress. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "Ava," I said gently, "I never needed you to be rich." She looked up at me. "I just needed you to be honest." She nodded and began crying in earnest then, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. I know, she said, and I'm sorry. I squeezed her hand. But I'm not just sorry because I hurt you, she said. I'm sorry because I almost taught myself to be ashamed of the person who loved me the hardest. I closed my eyes for a moment. That was the sentence I had been hoping to hear since the first dinner at Ethan's parents' house. Not because I wanted an apology, but because I wanted my daughter back. Not perfect, not proud in some fake way, just honest, just awake. After that day, things changed slowly. Not like a miracle, not like one speech fixed everything. Real healing never works that fast. It came in small moments. Ava started talking about her childhood again without embarrassment. She started telling Ethan stories about how I used to work nights and still pack her lunch in the morning. She told him about how I patched her school uniforms by hand. She told him about the year we had no heater and slept in the same blanket to stay warm. And instead of hiding those memories, she began saying them like they were part of her strength. One evening, Ethan came to my house alone. That surprised me. He stood at the door, looking uncomfortable, holding a small box of pastries from a bakery downtown. I hope this is okay, he said. I stepped aside and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where so much had already happened, and he took a long breath before speaking. I owe you an apology, he said. I folded my hands and listened. He looked down at the box between us. I didn't fully understand what Ava had been doing, he said, and I didn't understand why she seemed so nervous about her background. I thought it was just her being shy. But after dinner with my parents, after hearing you speak, I realized she wasn't the one ashamed. She was afraid of being judged. I waited. He looked at me directly then. My family can be old-fashioned, he said carefully. Sometimes they confuse class with character. I didn't challenge that enough. His honesty was quiet, but it mattered, because sometimes the people around shame do not create it, but they help keep it alive by staying silent. He continued, I want you to know that I respect you. I gave him a long look. Respect is an easy word to say when someone has already done the hard work of earning it. So I asked him something simple. Do you respect where Ava came from? He nodded immediately. Yes. Then make sure she never has to explain it away again. He looked serious then. My family can be old-fashioned, he said carefully. Sometimes they confuse class with character. I didn't challenge that enough. His honesty was quiet, but it mattered, because sometimes the people around shame do not create it, but they help keep it alive by staying silent. He continued, I want you to know that I respect you. I gave him a long look. Respect is an easy word to say when someone has already done the hard work of earning it. So I asked him something simple. Do you respect where Ava came from? He nodded immediately. Yes. Then make sure she never has to explain it away again. He looked serious then. I will. I believed he meant it. Not because men always keep promises. They do not. But because he finally looked uncomfortable in the right way. Not uncomfortable because poor people were in the room. Uncomfortable because he understood what he had almost allowed to happen. Ava and Ethan got married that summer. It was not a huge Hollywood-style event. It was elegant, yes. Beautiful, yes. But not in a way that erased where anyone came from. I sat in the front row wearing my blue dress again. Ava asked me to wear it, because she said it was the dress she loved most on me. When she walked down the aisle, she looked at me first. Not Ethan, me. And when our eyes met, I saw my little girl again. The one who used to run to me with scraped knees. The one who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on the bus ride home. The one who used to believe, before the world complicated everything, that love was enough. At the reception, people danced, laughed, and took pictures. A few of Ethan's relatives came up to speak with me more kindly than before. Maybe they had changed. Maybe they had only learned to be polite in front of a crowd. Either way, I did not need them to approve of me anymore. That was the real change. I no longer needed to be accepted by people who only understood value when it came with a price tag. I had already taught my daughter the truth, and she had finally listened. Later that night, Ava came to me one last time before the evening ended. She was holding her new husband's hand, but her eyes were on me. She said, "Mom, can I ask you something?" Of course. She hesitated for a moment. "Why didn't you ever get angry with me in public? Why didn't you shame me back?" I smiled sadly. "Because I knew shame had already done enough damage," I said. "I didn't want to feed it." She looked down and nodded. Then I placed my hand on hers and said the truth that every mother carries in silence at least once in her life. Sometimes a mother has to let her child see the cost of disrespect without making them hate themselves forever. Ava's eyes filled with tears again. "I almost lost you," she whispered. I shook my head. "No," I said. "You almost lost yourself." That was the harder truth. Because a mother can survive being misunderstood. A mother can survive being overlooked. A mother can survive being called difficult, dramatic, or old-fashioned. What she cannot survive easily is watching her child choose status over self-respect. Watching her child believe that being accepted by strangers matters more than honoring the person who raised them. That is the kind of wound that does not bleed on the outside. It bleeds quietly, in the places nobody sees. Months passed. Ava grew softer again, not weaker. Softer in the way a person becomes after healing. She laughed more easily. She stopped editing herself. She started inviting me over without hesitation. And one afternoon, while we were drinking tea in my kitchen, she said something I will never forget. "I used to think you were the one who didn't understand that world," she said. "But now I think you understood it better than I did." I raised an eyebrow. She smiled through tears. "You knew money could buy comfort, but not character. You knew expensive people were not always wise. You knew a small house could still raise a strong woman. I thought you were behind the times, but really, you were the one who knew what mattered." I looked at her for a long time. Then I reached for her hand. "That's because I already learned the hard lesson," I said. She waited. I took a breath. "I once chased approval too," I admitted. "Long before you were born. I wanted to be seen as worthy, as enough, as respectable. But life taught me something. When you spend your whole heart trying to impress people who would never carry your burdens, you end up abandoning the people who already would." Ava sat very still. I continued. "I did not want that for you. Ever." She nodded slowly, and then she whispered, "Thank you for not letting me disappear." That sentence stayed in my chest for days, because that was exactly what I had been fighting for. Not just to prove a point, not just to protect my pride. I was fighting so my daughter would not disappear inside someone else's idea of who she should be. I wanted her to know that she was not made less by her humble beginnings. I wanted her to know that a mother's life is not something to be embarrassed by. I wanted her to understand that real strength is not pretending you came from somewhere else. Real strength is standing in the truth of where you came from and still holding your head high. So yes, I became the bad guy that season. I became the difficult one, the one who made the room uncomfortable, the one who refused to shrink, the one who would not let my child turn love into performance. And I would do it again, 1,000 times. I would do it again. Because if my daughter ever had to choose between status and self-respect, I wanted her to know which one her mother would fight for. Not the status. Never the status. Self-respect. Always self-respect. And if you are listening to this story right now, I want you to remember something very simple. A mother's love is not always soft. Sometimes it is a warning. Sometimes it is a boundary. Sometimes it is the hard truth that stops a child from losing themselves in a world that only values appearances. Sometimes love has to sound like no. Sometimes it has to stand in front of shame and say, "Not my child." Because the greatest gift a mother can give is not a life without struggle. It is a life where her child knows they are worthy, even when the world tells them otherwise. And that is why, in the end, I did not lose my daughter. I found her again. Not in the room full of wealth, not in the polished faces, not in the perfect dinner table. I found her the moment she finally understood that the woman she had once been embarrassed by was the very reason she had enough strength to stand tall. And that is the truth I will carry for the rest of my life. A mother may have rough hands. A mother may have a simple home. A mother may not have the kind of money that opens every door. But if she gives her child love, sacrifice, and self-respect, then she has given them something richer than gold. For a while after the wedding, I thought the hardest part was over. I thought the battle had been won quietly. I thought the worst wound had healed. But life has a strange way of testing the lessons it teaches. Because sometimes the real challenge does not come when people are angry. It comes later, when they are calm, when they think the danger is gone, when they believe the story has already ended. That was how it happened with Ava. At first, she seemed settled into married life. She visited often. She called more. She laughed easier. There was light in her voice again, the kind of light I had missed for so long. But little by little, I noticed something else, something subtle, something that did not belong. She had started talking about standards again, not in a cruel way, not yet, but in the same careful tone she had once used with me. She said things like, "Ethan's family does things a certain way," or, "They're not trying to be mean, they just value image," or, "Sometimes I think I should be more polished." That word again, polished. I had heard it before, and every time I heard it, I felt the old fear start to wake up inside me. Because polished sounds harmless, but sometimes polished is just another word for hidden, another word for edited, another word for a life that must be softened before it can be accepted. One Sunday afternoon, Ava came over alone. She looked tired, not the kind of tired from work, the kind that comes from carrying too many thoughts at once. She sat in my living room for a long time before speaking. Then she finally said, "Mom, can I ask you something without you getting upset?" I looked at her. "I may not like the question," I said, "but you can ask it." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Do you think I changed too much?" It was such a small question, but it hit me harder than I expected. Because it was the kind of question people ask only after they have already begun to fear the answer. I leaned back in my chair and studied her face. She looked beautiful, yes, but beauty is not always the same as peace. And her eyes did not look peaceful. They looked uncertain. So I asked, "What do you think?" She looked down. "I think," she said carefully, "that I've been trying too hard to fit into a world that doesn't fully see me." My heart pulled tight. I stayed silent, so she could keep going. She took a breath and continued, "Sometimes I sit at dinner with Ethan's relatives, and I feel like I have to be a better version of myself just to be tolerated. I don't know how to explain it. They're not cruel exactly, but I always feel like I'm being measured." I nodded, because I knew exactly what she meant. There are people who do not insult you directly. They do something colder. They make you feel like you must earn your place at every table. And if you are not careful, after enough time, you begin to judge yourself the way they judge you. Ava rubbed her forehead. "I thought marrying into that family would give me a bigger life," she said. "But sometimes it just makes me feel smaller." Those words made me go quiet. Because there it was again, the old lie. The lie that a bigger house means a bigger heart. The lie that expensive surroundings make a person safer. The lie that status can protect you from loneliness. I reached for her hand and said, "Listen to me carefully." She looked up. "Being around wealth does not make you weak," I said. "But believing wealth defines your worth can make you miserable." Her eyes filled immediately. I continued, "You do not need to become someone else to deserve love. And you do not need to erase your roots to prove you belong. She let out a shaky breath. I know that now, she said. I just wish I had known it before. I smiled sadly. Most people only learn after pain, I said. That is why wisdom is often expensive. She gave a small laugh through her tears. Then she leaned against the couch and whispered, Mom, sometimes I think I was embarrassed, not just of our past, but of how deeply I loved it. That sentence stayed with me, because it was the truth no one wants to say out loud. Sometimes people are not only ashamed of being poor, they are ashamed of the tenderness that came with it. The homemade meals, the patched clothes, the shared blankets, the hand-me-down toys. The life that may have been hard but was full of sincerity. A life where love was not a performance. A life where nobody had to pretend to be perfect. And when the world teaches you that only the polished things matter, you begin to look at your own memories like they belong to someone else. I squeezed her hand and said, You never need to be ashamed of love that was real. She closed her eyes. And in that moment, I could see her fighting something inside herself. Not just guilt, identity. Because once a person starts chasing acceptance, they do not only change their habits, they change the way they see themselves. That is the danger. That is why I had fought so hard. Not just because I wanted my daughter to respect me. I wanted her to remember herself. A week later, Ethan came over too. He had started doing that more often. At first, I thought it was politeness. Then I realized it was something deeper. He was trying to learn, trying to understand, trying in his own careful way to become the kind of husband who did not just love Ava but protected her dignity. He sat at the kitchen table with us while I made tea. Ava looked nervous, but he reached for her hand under the table, and that small gesture told me more than any speech could have. He had noticed the fracture, and maybe, finally, he wanted to help mend it. He looked at me and said, Ava told me something I should have seen earlier. I waited. He continued. She said she sometimes feels pressure to be less herself around my family. I said nothing, because I wanted him to continue without hiding behind excuses. He lowered his eyes and said, That should never have happened. I appreciated that he did not say, That was not my intention, because intentions matter less than harm, and he seemed to know that now. He said, I cannot change who my family is, but I can change how I respond to them. I nodded once. That's the part that matters, I said. He looked up. I should have defended her more clearly, he admitted. Not just privately, publicly. I should have made it clear that her background is not something to minimize. Ava sat beside him, quiet and emotional. I could see she was relieved to hear him say it. And I was relieved too. Not because everything was solved, but because accountability had entered the room, and accountability is where healing starts. I told him, there is a difference between loving a woman and making her feel safe in your world. He listened carefully. I continued, if your world makes her feel smaller, then your job is not to ask her to shrink. It is to make your world big enough for her to stand tall. He nodded, and I could tell, by the way he held still, that he understood the weight of those words. The months that followed were not dramatic. There was no sudden transformation that made everything perfect. Life never works that cleanly. But there were changes. Real honest. Slow ones. Important ones. Ava stopped apologizing for her childhood. She stopped hiding the words, my mom worked 2 jobs. She stopped translating our life into something more acceptable. At family events, she began speaking about me with pride again. Not loud pride, not performative pride. Quiet, steady pride, the kind that grows from finally knowing the truth. One evening, Ethan's mother invited us to a dinner at their home. Ava called me before going and asked, "Will you come?" There was no hesitation in her voice this time. No embarrassment. No warning. Just trust. So, I said yes. When we arrived, Mrs. Kingsley greeted me warmly. Not perfectly, but warmly enough that I could see the difference. People can change a little when they have been forced to look at themselves. At dinner, she surprised me by asking about my work. Not in a judgmental way. In a real way. She asked how I had managed to raise Ava alone. She asked what it was like when she was a child. She asked about the years I had spent saving every cent. I answered honestly, not to impress her, not to win her over, just because the truth had finally earned its place at the table. And as I spoke, I noticed something happening to Ava. She was not shrinking. She was not flinching. She was watching me with eyes full of something softer than fear. Admiration. That was the moment I knew she had come back to herself. Not because she suddenly rejected her husband's world. Not because she became angry at it, but because she no longer believed she had to erase her own story to enter it. After dinner, Mrs. Kingsley walked me to the door. She paused and said, "I misunderstood a great deal before." I looked at her. She continued carefully, "I thought refinement was what made a family strong, but now I see that discipline, sacrifice, and devotion are also forms of refinement." I did not answer right away. Then I said, "They are the finest kind." She nodded, and for the first time her smile looked genuine. Not because she had become a different person overnight, but because she had finally stopped pretending that class was the same as worth. After that, things became easier. Not perfect, just easier. And sometimes easier is enough. But the deepest change happened one quiet morning in my kitchen. Ava came over before work, still in her coat, with tired eyes and a soft smile. She sat down, took my hands in hers, and looked at them for a long moment. Then she said, "I used to be embarrassed by these hands." I froze. She looked up quickly. "Not because they were yours," she said, "because they told the truth about where we came from. I thought the world would respect me more if my life looked smoother. But now, I know these hands are the reason I became who I am." My eyes burned. She continued, "They taught me what endurance looks like. They taught me what sacrifice looks like. They taught me how much love a person can carry without ever asking for applause." I couldn't speak, so she did. "I don't ever want to be ashamed of you again," she whispered. And I answered in the only way I could. "Then don't be ashamed of yourself either." That made her cry, and she laughed at the same time. That mix of laughter and tears is one of the sweetest sounds in a mother's life, because it means the heart is healing. It means the truth has found its way home. Years can pass, and children can forget many things. They forget meals. They forget outfits. They forget the way the house sounded on rainy nights. But they never truly forget the feeling of being loved enough to be corrected, loved enough to be challenged, loved enough to be told, "No, you do not get to dishonor yourself just because someone else has more money." That is the kind of love that lasts. That is the kind of love that shapes a soul. So if you ask me now whether I regret being the bad guy in my daughter's story, the answer is no. Because I was never fighting against her. I was fighting for the part of her that knew better. For the part of her that still remembered home. For the part of her that still believed love should not come with shame attached. And she found that part again. Not because I gave her an easy lesson, but because I refused to let her walk away from herself. That is what mothers do sometimes. They stand in the way of the wrong lesson. They become the obstacle to the lie. They become the voice that says, "You may be embarrassed of me for a moment, but I will not let you live embarrassed of yourself forever." That is not cruelty. That is protection. That is love with a backbone. And if there is one thing I hope anyone takes from our story, it is this. Your background is not a mistake. Your mother is not a liability. Your humble beginning is not a weakness, and no amount of money is worth the cost of forgetting who loved you first. Because in the end, status fades, impressions fade, the praise of people who barely know you fades, but the love that built you, that stays. It stays in your voice. It stays in your habits. It stays in the way you carry yourself when no one is clapping. And if you are lucky, one day you look at the woman who raised you and realize she was never the person you needed to outgrow. She was the foundation you needed to stand on.